Hi, this is Tracy. It's April 30th, and in yesterday's meeting, I had offered to sort of summarize many of the models that we've looked at so far to see where the common elements were, to see if we now have a consensus as a group as to where we want to take our own new model. So basically, what did I do? I tried to summarize some of the presumptions that have come up when we discuss these things, just to make sure that we all share the same focus for this project. Then I looked at some of the vocabulary that's often used, but sometimes we're mixing terms, so I just want to make sure we're all on the same page with that. And then to discuss some of the models of teachers' pedagogical knowledge. What is it that we really know about how teachers learn how to be teachers? And so I broke those down into 4 big groups. The first is focused on teachers, the personal characteristics of the individual, how they grow from being novice to expert teachers. The second has to do with a category of teaching models that are focused on real mechanics or curriculum or evaluation or methodologies, or basically how an individual teaches in the classroom. How does that person transmit knowledge or whatever, okay? The third type of model is the big discussion between content knowledge versus pedagogical knowledge, or what to teach versus how to teach. The fourth model has to do, or the group of models has to do with societal or environmental models of teachers' pedagogical knowledge, basically the influence of the community or expectations of society, as well as cultural influences. So after looking at those models really briefly, I want to see if we can come to a consensus about what is missing. And I think we all feel really comfortable with this idea of mind-brain education science. That is a missing piece here that we need to add. I'm not sure how much we share this idea of 21st century skills, but I know we talked a little bit with Marilyn, chimed in about this, about technology. I know that we need to include technology, and I think the easiest framework to do that within would be 21st century skills. But so basically, some of these things, this is all from an individual perspective, so I'm not really sure. I tried to document what we were saying as a group to see if I was following everyone, and basically as an exercise for myself to make sure that I'm not too far off base with what we're coming up with. So anyways, let's try to see how this goes. I am presuming basically that our goal is to improve student learning by reconsidering teachers' new pedagogical knowledge. The end result should be improved student learning. I also presume that we all accept that the role of the teacher is fundamental, and that it's the single most important influence over the learning process is the quality of the teacher, okay? And I'm also presuming that teacher new pedagogical knowledge is different from old models, which means that we need to add some things. We need to add some things because the old model differs because of mind-brain education and science, and because of technology, and also just the times we live in, right? There's different expectations of learners in the 21st century. However, I don't think, and this is where I might be wrong, but I don't think we need to toss out the old, and come up with, something totally new on our own. Nobody needs to reinvent the wheel. I think we can use what was really good or what has been presented in other models, and then sort of build off of that, and maybe expand in some areas. I think that's probably the way to go instead of just starting all over, okay? There is some vocabulary we need to share. Content knowledge is basically the subject matter that's taught, okay? And tell me, these are definitions that came from Schulman, so maybe other people are using other people's definitions, but just for the purpose of this particular presentation, this is how I've looked at it, just so in case I make a reference to something, it's clear. Pedagogical knowledge is basically how to teach, knowing how the best way is to approach teaching given any particular objective in the learning atmosphere. General pedagogic knowledge is different from specific pedagogic knowledge, okay? So general pedagogic knowledge has to do with just understanding that you need to have good planning and classroom management, where specific knowledge would have to do with what do you do, what is the best methodology or activity for a given objective, okay? And pedagogical content knowledge has to do with combining basically what we know about pedagogy with the subject at hand. So knowing how best to teach third grade math, all right? I also use the word competency based on the OECD definition. It's the combination of knowledge, skills, and attitudes. These definitions I basically made up, but mind-brain education is what I envision as being the intersection of psychology, which is the mind, neuroscience, which is the brain, and pedagogy, which is education. Educational neuroscience is often used in a similar way. It's sort of the way I see it, though, unfortunately, is that education ends up being a subfield of neuroscience. Neuroscience is the biggie, education is like the modifier there. The same way, sort of, you flip it around, neuroeducation, it sort of gives dominance to the aspect of education, and the neuro is kind of the add-on there. I don't ever use this idea of brain-based learning or brain-based teaching just because it's very much associated with commercial attempts to sell things to teachers. So whenever we make reference to things related to what we know about the brain and how it learns best, I'm going to be using mind-brain education. Okay, so let's look at the models. The first of the 4 models is the teacher-focused models. And this just sees the teacher as humane, caring, loving, and that teacher is always evolving and growing with us. And this basically sees the teacher as, being nice. This is a nice person. They're helpful, they're patient, they're funny, they're clever, reliable. So basically, there are models of teachers' pedagogical knowledge that really have as their base these personality characteristics of an individual teacher and how those should develop. So basically, how we think, this idea that anybody can learn. So this comes with this other idea, another model or this other submodel, which is kind of like the teacher believes in me. The teacher knows that I can learn, so they can encourage me all the time, right? I'm highly motivated because my teacher believes in me. And there's also kind of additional submodels here that are how a teacher makes me feel. I feel so good in this environment that I want to learn, okay? So because I feel wanted, I feel comfortable in my learning situation, so I'm going to learn better. This isn't just these touchy-feely models. This also UNESCO came up with a lot of these ideas that have to do with, confidence and trustworthiness and being flexible and having a passion for learning. So we know that these characteristics are highly important in certain teaching models and most probably in our own, because we know this connection with the other is hugely important in all learning. I know more about myself because I can compare myself with others, and therefore, when I feel good with others, I feel good about myself and my own learning. So anyways, this idea that we have to have a model that focuses somehow on characteristics of good teachers, okay? Tuckman sort of took this to an extreme, sort of had students grade their teachers, based on only, these personality characteristics. Are they rude, or are they warm, or are they lively, or are they passionate, or are they orderly, or are they efficient, or are they dependent, or, snobby? All of these kinds of words are very, very much in the, a perceptive realm. Does the teacher make me feel good about where I am? Do I feel good learning in this teacher's presence? So basically, Tuckman also, he sort of modified his vision a little bit 10 years later, and also considered, how important it was to be organized as well as, creative. But these ideas of, being dynamic and warm are still very, very important to him, as you can see in his models. So in these kinds of teacher models, we also know that there's the second big element. One is the teacher characteristics. The other one has to do with the presumption that the teacher is always evolving as an individual, right? So, they remain caring and warm and fuzzy and all the rest of it. But they're also lifelong learners. And this is sort of meant to happen along a continuum. You start off at a lower level and you get better and better as you move on. So you can be a pre-service teacher, then there's an induction phase, and then you have continual professional development. But there's a presumption in some of these teaching models or teacher pedagogical knowledges that you have to continually evolve. That is part of the profession, okay? This is sort of taken to an extreme from going from this integration model, where you just, have the subject matter knowledge, you know how to teach it, and then, you know about your environment, to actually getting feedback from that environment. So now, having taught something, now I know how to I actually have improved how to teach it. So basically this back and forth model, that it's not just in one direction, but that I'm constantly learning as I teach. I am learning more about how to teach, and that makes it more a transformational model of learning. Kajal tried to sort of summarize all of these different ideas all in one. So there's teachers' pedagogical knowledge, knowledge of the curriculum, and what should be known, and what is the core of the dates, facts, formulas that somebody should know. But then also, how does that learning process actually function, and what would be the best way to go about teaching that, okay? And how does each piece fit into this larger curriculum? So then he matched this up with teachers' values and beliefs, as well as, the whole educational context, all right? And all of this is within the mind of, or the brain of a teacher, which means it's also highly influenced by what the teacher thinks about learning. Is learning fluid? Can people learn? Okay, so those are the teacher models. The teaching models are slightly different. They do still include things that have to do with having supportive climates and all the rest of it, but they talk more about functional aspects of learning, like, are there enough opportunities to learn, or has the learning been scaffolded, or is there coherent content, given the objectives of the class? So these teaching models focus very much, and they judge teachers actually based on whether or not they can structure lessons in a way in which students, the outcome will be student learning. So do they present ideas? Do they respond to queries? Do they give examples? Do they evaluate things? Do they choose to use good definitions? Do they have application? Okay, so these kinds of steps, it's more of a process-oriented model than the teacher aspect, which is more of on characteristics. So Krauss summarized this really simply in saying, it's knowing, what has to be done, and knowing what the student already knows about it, and then knowing how to teach that. Lowick actually summarized, and actually this is more Ouida's work, but basically a teacher who is clear, who shows flexibility, which means they can differentiate their lessons, that shows enthusiasm or is passionate for their work, that they have a get down to business attitude. It's not that kids can goof off and do whatever they want, but there's a program, all of these different elements are also included as being characteristics of strong teaching environments, not necessarily the teacher themselves, but basically that the processes have been structured in such a way that students will achieve learning, okay? And this goes into Sheeran's work. There is an emphasis on the curriculum, what is taught, but most of the other elements have to do with how that is actually taught. Okay, so is there feedback? Is there a good climate? Were the strategies that were chosen and the methodologies that were used relevant? This aligns a lot with what Hattie talks about in his work, and knowing what has positive impacts on student learning. So does a teacher have credibility in the student's eyes? Have there been reciprocal learning or reciprocal teaching activities? Are the students being taught metacognitive skills? So all of these things we know do have a high impact on student learning outcomes. This is the same list. This is Hattie's list, but it's only sorted for things. There's 47 things that teachers have a direct influence over. So, while there's a correlation between low birth weight and problems with learning, that's something that a teacher can't do anything about, right? So this is Hattie's 150 influences, tapered down to just 47 that have to do with things that teachers can actually influence. So then the National Institute for Excellence in Teaching from the States took this a little bit further, tried to break down these ideas of what is this process that's taking place in the classroom, what is the teaching experience. So it has to do with instruction, it has to do with how the teacher crafts a learning environment, how do we design and plan for instruction as well as assessment, and what are the responsibilities of the teacher. So now there's no touchy-feely what are the characteristics of the teacher, but it's more focused on the responsibilities. So that's a second model. This third group of model has to do with this idea of content versus pedagogical models. There's a lot of people who have these, lovely Venn diagrams, but I have to ask, is it really just subject matter pedagogical knowledge and knowledge of student learning is at that intersection, or is it really the sum of them? And I hope we all agree that teachers have to know their subject, they have to know how to teach it, and they have to know what students already know in order to fill that gap. And that, to me, is a new angle on teacher pedagogical knowledge. We see that general pedagogical knowledge is needed. The teacher also has to have subject matter knowledge. Then you have to know how to teach that particular subject, because teaching a kid third grade math is not the same as teaching, 11th grade literature. All right, so there's different pedagogical tools that can be used for different subject matter. We also have to add into that, or put into this mix, a knowledge of the student context and understanding of the environment. Where is that student coming from? What does his past knowledge tell us? And then being able to give good examples so that student can place that information to real life context. Teachers' pedagogical knowledge can't then just be about pedagogy and about subject matter. We have to be, a little bit more focused on the learners, the environment we're working in, the school systems we're in, and also what is it that's been imposed upon us to teach? What is the curriculum structure that we're actually teaching within? So this is kind of splitting these two ideas. So Schulman said, there's this subject matter knowledge, and then there's pedagogical content knowledge. So basically sort of, making a divide of that, but saying that, they're part of this whole that all teachers have to be able to dominate at all these different levels. The reason this was broken down is to actually make it more manageable to teach teachers so that they could actually understand, okay, yes, you need to know the math formula, but you need to know what's most appropriate given the student's past knowledge about that, what would be the right pedagogical approach for that kid. And so once again, Schulman's summary is that there's general pedagogical knowledge of the learners themselves, of the context in which they're learning things, and understanding of why you would learn X, in the context of the curriculum, the entire curriculum, and what place or what role does this piece of knowledge play in the greater formation of the individual that graduates from that school, okay? Understanding the content knowledge of the subject itself, the curriculum structure, basically, what place in the curriculum is this particular piece of knowledge and has it been contextualized? And then pedagogical content knowledge, basically putting that all together. One of the models I really liked a lot, this is from the Max Planck Institute in Germany. They basically, put, 4 big pieces: professional knowledge, beliefs, values, and goals, motivational orientations, and self-regulation. Those get subdivided. Professional knowledge gets broken down into several other pieces. Professional knowledge is actually content knowledge, pedagogical content knowledge, and organizational knowledge and counseling knowledge, how to pastor students through this process. And then there's facets of knowledge. So there's sort of time-bound or chronologically structured. So anyways, this is another way that we can actually look at teachers' pedagogical knowledge within a teaching context. Cheaton and Chivers, sort of took this sort of one scale up and sort of considered also meta competencies. So basically, even though we're not spelling it out, teachers as well as students need to develop communication skills, creativity, problem solving, learning. They need to self-regulate and self-develop and be mentally agile and problem solving and analyze things, and all of this within a context of reflection. So basically their emphasis is on the reflective teacher. And this kind of goes into this transformative learning aspect that we saw in the teacher models, except for the fact that reflection is for the sole purpose, it's not of personal growth. It has to do with becoming a better teacher. Like Boluyi, I don't know if that's how you pronounce his name, came up with this other idea then to really highlight the importance of the social context. And then I guess it's Seidel and Shavelson, they sort of stole the exact same idea. If you look at it, it's exactly the same thing, but it's just a little prettier here. But basically structuring it in the format of the domain of learning. So what is it that you're learning? Are we learning math? Are we learning literature? Are we learning science? How much time is dedicated to that particular task in homework and structure because we know that it's quantity and quality. Is there enough time set aside for that particular learning goal? The organization of the learning, are we giving examples and then we're asking students to produce things, or are we asking them to experiment with something and then discovery learning? So how do you organize that learning experience? Fourth is the social context. that the learning takes place within, because what might work with a group of Latinos might not work with the Korean students, so you have to sort of make sure that in the social and cultural context you're on target. And all of this is within the frame of goal setting and orientation, sharing with the students, this is what we're going to do today, or this is what I hope you know by the end of the day. So sort of laying out the competencies, the knowledge, skills, or attitudes that you're hoping that the students shoot for, and orienting them by telling them, so we're going to do X, Y, and Z so that we get to that stage, all right? So the 6 is the execution of the learning, so that actually has to do with what is applied, what methodologies, what activities, what actions are taken within the class. So that is how you execute the whole process, basically when that learning moment occurs. There's an evaluation, assessment of what's happened there, and there's a rethinking about this. And the regulation and monitoring of this come both from the student and from the teacher himself. So basically trying to understand, okay, did I do this well, or at what stage did I mess up, or what piece am I missing from myself? And this kind of gap analysis occurs. What did I want them to know, and what do they know, or what do I need to know as a student, and what do I now know, and what am I missing in order to reach that goal, okay? All of this takes place within the context of social interactions. These are basic processes. Domain-specific processing is what's happening during the execution of learning. Okay, so the fourth group of models has to do with societal or environmental models. And they basically take place within this concept of, there are national goals. I mean, the reason, we have formal education systems is to provide or to set up people for being good members of society. So basically, there are national goals we have to react to, and then our school environment helps us understand that, and that's a context within which we apply those national values. And then the teacher gets judged on whether or not they can execute and reach that. So we can decide if a teacher is effective or not if he's reached those goals within the context of society. We know that this also has to do with the environment if we consider the classroom, the classroom climate, the classroom ecology. How is that managed by the teacher, and how does the teacher himself or herself influence the climate of the classroom? Some go so far as to say, this is totally focused on community output, so building orderly and high-functional learning work environments. We need to create a robust culture of development and opportunities, and we need to have team-based learning all the time, and structures that allow students and teachers to work with their peers closely. So some teacher pedagogical models focus very, very strongly on this societal element. What I'd like to suggest then is maybe those are all good things, but how could we marry all of those things together and then see if we even go beyond that? So one way to do this, and I think it's very clever, when they were setting up the Pisa core competencies, the OECD published a document in which they stated there's really only 3 things that we're trying to measure here, or that would be the core competencies for a 15-year-old to have. They can interact with heterogeneous groups, which means that they can work within communities or diverse populations, okay? They can act autonomously. That means they don't wait for somebody else to tell them how to do things. They can make decisions on their own. And they can use tools, and that could be language, technology, that could be their neighbor, that could be a dictionary, that could be a computer. But basically they know how to find the answers. They know what tools will help them get there. So one way you might marry all of these different visions and pull this back to being a bit more balanced within the teacher-student relationship is to consider these 3 competencies as a guiding tool. Other models that we've seen, Sonia, have to do with looking at learning processes on one end. Okay, so here's the teacher's pedagogical knowledge, and here's how we assess and diagnose things from the student's perspective. And on the student side, we have social factors, cognitive factors, affective factors, physical factors, environmental factors. And on the teacher's side of it, you have all of these teaching processes, right? What is the best methodology to apply our activities, right? We also know the classroom management and organization is very distinct from just, I know how to teach this. Well, do you know how to manage that group so that you can successfully teach is another thing. The developmental stages of a kid, you need to understand that. The instructional methods that are available, how to approach different kids because of cultural diversity. using technology here, curriculum structures, and also just teacher attitudes towards themselves, self-efficacy, values, beliefs about learning, okay? And all of this within the context of the school, home, community that one lives within. So, Sonia, you're going to find this really funny, but there's somebody who actually came up with something really close to what you were saying. But trying to cross this, teacher's pedagogical reasoning with the student's pedagogical reasoning. How does the student then take from that experience, and where is it that they actually cross over? Where is this balance here? So this is where in the other graph we're looking at what was called affordances for learning. Okay, so this is the space where we can actually learn when these things actually come together. Another way to sort of divide this, the teacher's beliefs versus the students, is again looking at this concept of affordances. And those actually turn out to be, within a learning context, what can actually be done? What actions can I do and actually produce learning outcomes, okay? Leeds in University of Newcastle is tried now to sort of take this learning outcomes thing and say, well, what is it dependent on? And a lot is dependent on the teaching context, right? The classroom environment, the teacher's behavior, all right? Their perceptions, characteristics, the teacher's skill, craft, how they actually execute, what is the pedagogical content, the subject knowledge. But on the other end, you have the students' behaviors, their characteristics, and their perceptions. So basically, this idea is really getting into Sonia's head a bit, I think, about, how do we balance this teaching learning process between the responsibilities of teachers and learners, okay? In Singapore, they've tried, this is very elaborate. It's basically trying to say from the context, from a societal context, okay, looking at all of our stakeholders as well as the global environment that we live in, how can we develop teachers so that they can align the way that they can teach to the outcomes that we're looking for the students, okay? So there's certain skills that we want the students to have. We want them to be more self-directed. We want them to self-evaluate. So we look at all those things. And then it's validated, and then it comes back again and goes in a full loop, and then we continue to look at this grand scheme of things. In the Japanese system, it's kind of similar. This is only focused on curriculum, but they set up the objectives, and then what the content would look like to deliver those objectives. And then we divide that into subjects, or not official subjects, but these are kind of like connectors between all of the different subjects, right? Things that will link things all together. For example, critical thinking might not be a specific subject that's taught. It's a non-subject, but it does across all subject areas, okay? And then from that, you make the decision about your teaching methods. But the actors that are involved here, it's a teacher-student processing, okay? And based on the teacher's understanding of the student, then you can choose the right materials given the educational objectives that exist. United States National Center for Research on Teaching and Learning basically divides this idea into four big arenas, right? One would be the tools for learning. Other one is situated learning, exemplified by professional learning communities. So here's the individual teacher and their tools, and here's the community they're in. 3 is the sites for teacher learning. So do the schools actually facilitate? Does the community actually encourage learning? And the 4th area, which is content knowledge and research learning to content-specific pedagogy. So understanding your subject well enough so that you know the best tools to actually teach that. New Zealand has a really nice model. I like this a lot. It's kind of clean. But it's a competencies-based model which takes into consideration the cognitive elements, the technical elements of the particular subject area, ethical formation of the teacher, organizational structure of the classroom, and interpersonal contact with the student, all within the context of a particular environment. In South Africa, based on Carlsen, they came up with another model which looks very much, I think, like Sonia's model, except for we lost the teacher here somewhere. I'm not sure where the teacher really is, because we have the classroom and we have the students, but we don't and we have the context, the social context that they're learning within. I suppose the teacher is the person executing all of these things, right? They have their general pedagogical knowledge, they have the subject matter knowledge, and then all of that comes together, and so we know how to actually deal with the student and make them learn best. There's this kind of evolution then from an individual level of analysis, right, where we have a vision, We have understanding, motivation, practice. Well, then there's this community level where you can have a shared vision, shared knowledge base, community of practice, right? And you have commitment. So not only is the teacher, this Lone Ranger kind of a teacher achieving things, but there's a community level of analysis of problems or learning problems, and they're dealt with together. So when you get to this higher level, then you have the community that also can give feedback towards successful practices or not. And if that's taken even further, then you end up having like these policy level decisions that can be made based on this. And when you do that, the whole society wins. We have stronger moral capital, we have stronger curricular capital, we have stronger technical capital, we have stronger venture capital. Basically, we have a better system. This is, a very business-oriented model, but the idea is that, you're producing the types of people that society needs then for success, okay? Some of the summary ideas, there's basically 5 clusters. They call them clusters of attributes here. So a cognitive cluster relates to actually how does that person think, understand, how have we developed their analytical skills. The dispositional cluster has to do with, envisioning. Can you believe in yourself as a learner? Do you respect other people and their ability to actually think differently, but actually also learn with you, right? Motivational cluster, which has to do with the willingness to learn, perseverance, right? A performance cluster that has to do with enacting, coordinating, articulating, and initiating actions. And a reflective cluster, which basically starts the whole process all over again. Now that we would live through this, now how do we rethink this and do it better the next time? Okay, and this would be the way that we foster a community of learners. So there's all of these sub areas that are sort of broken down here, not at all unlike all the other things that we've looked at so far. Interdisciplinary content knowledge, curriculum understanding, classroom assessment, understanding individual needs. All of those things are basically things that came up in other aspects. Here are the OECD and policy recommendations related to evaluation of teachers. There was this 4 huge categories of what would need to be evaluated. So this gives us some indicator then of another type of model that would measure the success of a teacher by their ability to plan and prepare for class, the way the class environment feels or is structured, how the teacher actually teaches, and then the achievement of professional responsibilities, which is very interesting. So they consider that a teacher's role is not only limited to student learning outcomes, but actually teachers are responsible for the development of their whole learning communities. And another vision, this comes from an Australian example, Teachers for the 21st Century. This was talking about, motivators for teachers to improve their practice through evaluation. But I liked the Australian example because here they've actually broken down almost the same pieces as we've been seeing all along, right? That they competent and they understand the curriculum and structure within which they're teaching. A sound knowledge base of how to assess and how to teach. They understand their subject areas. They continue to develop understandings. They're culturally sensitive. They communicate well with families. So basically, they talk about not only the individual links and understanding content knowledge and the student, but also within the community structure within which they live. The 10 standards here from the Chief State School Officers, the Interstate Teaching Assessment Model and Support Consortium actually has 10 very, very well thought out structures. Now, again, this is how people are going to judge whether or not a teacher has been a good teacher. This is not the model of Teachers Pedagogical Knowledge, but it's basically saying, well, we're going to judge you on this. So it's basically presuming then that teachers know these 10 different things. So the first standard has to do with learner development. So this means that the teacher understands how learners grow and develop. So these are developmental stages that Daniel was talking about a bit yesterday, right? Number 2 is learning differences. That we understand that not all brains are prepared to do all things at the same level, at the same time. So we have to understand these concepts of differentiation in teaching. Learning environments is standard 3. The teacher works with others to create environments that support individual and collaborative learning. So this has to do with structuring learning situations, much as the Pisa recommends us, being able to work with heterogeneous groups, being able to work with people who are different than us, and actually creating this harmonious environment in which learning is motivated by a good setting, a good environment, right? Fourth has to do with content knowledge. As we said all along, a teacher shouldn't be a teacher if they don't know their subject, right? Standard 5 has to do with the application of the content. So the teacher understands how to connect concepts and use different perspectives to engage student learners, okay? So that they can integrate the information into different ways and they can actually teach the same thing in many different forms, all right? Assessment. The teacher understands the best way to assess and understand where a student's at and what the student needs in order to fill that gap, right? So that not only evaluation techniques or testing techniques, but they know how to assess and diagnose what a learner really needs. Standard 7 has to do for planning for instruction. So basically, this had to do with this initial point of, timing. Does the person know how much time this particular element will need to be able to be taught? How much reinforcement an individual student will need? So planning for instruction is key. Number 8 has to do with instructional strategies. So do you have a good toolkit of a variety of ways to teach the same thing and to match? It's not just choosing, what's the flavor of the month, it's case studies today or it's project-based learning or whatever it is. You have to match the instructional strategy to the objective, all right? So you have to choose the right type of strategy for the objective that you have in learning. 9 has to do with professional learning and ethical practice. This has to do with this continual growth, this idea that if I'm a teacher, I can never stop learning. Okay, that you have a disposition to be open to new learning, and that you can't get apples from a pear tree. You cannot ask students to do things that you yourself can't do yet, so you're always continually improving your practice. And number 10 is leadership and collaboration. We expect teachers not to just be great teachers in their own rooms, classrooms, but that they have a learning community that they can all contribute to and lead. It's not that just there's administrators who are leaders, but that every teacher can be a leader, and that you can help others grow in their own progress through the teaching profession. So now let's think about this. If we want to look at teachers' new pedagogical knowledge, what would that be? Given all of these past models, the teacher model, the teaching model, the content and pedagogical models, and the social environment models, can we add that to 21st century skills, which includes this big element of technology we talked about, to sort of like place us in our time, right now, as well as add to that mind-brain education? So basically the idea would be, can we pull all of those things together without just being an unwieldy model? So if we look at 21st century models, and we have those other 4 models that we've already looked at, let's look at the 21st century models. And these are student-centered. Unlike any of the other teacher pedagogical knowledge models previous to this, to our times, all 21st century learning models are totally student-focused. The student is in the middle. The student is the protagonist. The student isn't just the client. The student is the reason, the raison d'être. This is why we teach, is to basically help students develop, all right? And we also know that the 21st century skills focus on lifelong autonomous learners. And so here's a huge shakeup. Remember, we've been talking a lot about content knowledge. Well, here, now the focus is, it's not what you know as much as how you can think about it. So it's not whether you know, 100 different, math theorems or whatever, but what do you do with that? I mean, how deep can that help you go with new ideas? So it's not necessarily content focused. It's much more how to think about thinking in your own learning. And this is very, very controversial because it goes against this concept of standardized testing, which we'll get to in a second. So basically, this is we want it all kind of a generation, so it's deep and wide. So a 21st century learner, we not only want them to have the subject area knowledge, which is kind of on the fringes here, but we're looking for them to develop communication skills, have digital literacy, be lifelong learners, self-directed, that they can collaborate with others, that they are deep thinkers, problem solvers, that they're creative, and they have a sense of social responsibility, and they understand their place in the global world. So hopefully all that is taught through discipline areas or subject areas because they're not individual classes. So when we talk now about what is content knowledge, it's sort of this little fringe here in the white, that's content knowledge. So when you're being a teacher now in the 21st century, you're asked now to develop a lot of different types of skills as opposed to content area mastery, all right? Hopefully this ends up leaning towards engaged thinkers, ethical citizens, an entrepreneurial spirit, people who innovate and invent things across the lifespan. Now, this is like in the ideal world, right? Because now we're sort of trapped with this, idea of standardized testing. So we know that what we're being asked to produce on one end are people who can innovate, collaborate, be world citizens, and then we're sort of strapping them to like standardized testing models. So we, what is the ideal and what are we, I think this is, my best guess is this is why it's taken so long. It's 2013, guys. We're already well into the 21st century. So how come we haven't done this yet? And I think it's because things like accountability are very important still. So standardized tests have sort of been, the way out or the way to show that we've actually dominated certain content area knowledge. Now, how do you test then if somebody collaborates or innovates or is creative or is self-aware or manages good relationships? That isn't as easy as testing for math formulas. So we have a real problem with evaluation tools these days. Okay, so we know the 21st century learners are people who collaborate and they are looking for real problems to solve. They're not into the theory. And we know that to make our classrooms more energetic, when we are teaching that content knowledge, it really has to be authentic. It has to be connected to real life situations. So we try to put the kid in the middle there, right? And we know that we have to have these standards and assessment and the curriculum has to be devised and all the rest of that. But we're trying to develop, questioning and thinking and creative skills. We want them to have the technology that goes with that. So 21st century learning then, yes, there's a big techno aspect to that, which we're going to look at just a second. But there's also a very, very big element that has to do with learning-centered experiences in the classroom. This has a huge impact also on methodology. There's no more sage on the stage standing up in front of the classroom and just sort of preaching out to, to the students. There has to be this highly engaged learner who is the protagonist of his own processes, that he's actually applying information. So that means it lends itself to very distinct or very different types of teaching methodologies or activities or actions in the classroom than we used to do. So what does the 21st century's teacher look like? Are they just tech savvy or whatever? Or, do we still value this whole thing of the teacher as a personality and understanding of pedagogy? And what is it that we're really rewarding? And so this is, again, Singapore has considered, to have this 21st century learner, we're really looking at collaborative relationships, partnerships that have to do with in-school, out-of-school, real-life connection of the information. We also know that we have to have a far greater extended pedagogical repertoire. We have to have a lot bigger number of tools to respond to a greater number of pedagogical demands. Our content is no longer just math, history, science, reading. It's much broader. It has to do with service learning and getting on with others and problem-solving skills, which are a lot more nebulous and hard to nail down. So we need a greater number of tools to teach with, okay? So basically, if we take the old model and try to put it up to today's scrutiny, we're going to have some problems here, right? We know that the pedagogy is not all there. It's sort of dated. We know that the content is also, it's not just the subject areas that we're looking at now, so we have to consider all of these other elements. And then we've added this whole, huge green area of understanding technology and how technology actually changes the way, the interface of the learner to the environment. It's like, I'm sure, Johannes, you go to the doctor, and before you even go to the doctor, you've already Googled and you already know what you have. You have access to so much more information than you did as a kid. So nowadays, a lot of our savvy learners, the kids already know a lot of the stuff that we're trying to get to in the classroom. So we have to, step it up a notch and actually stretch kids in a different direction to be much more creative problem solvers and much more innovative in their own learning. So there are some constructs that try to do this. Learning by design looks at, authentic learning situations, experiential contact with information as opposed to just, static delivery of information by teachers, trying to develop creativity and focused on research-oriented approaches to help students gain different types of skills. This means that our, 21st century educator looks a lot different from, how they looked 50 years ago. They have to adapt. They have to communicate better. They have to continually learn themselves. They have to envision what's going to come around the corner. We can't be teaching, a 19th century curriculum in the 21st century. They have to lead, not just wait for somebody to guide them, because we know that administrators are probably going to be the last to catch on to this. And they have to model the behavior they're looking for, and they have to collaborate with their students and also with the rest of their learning community. But this can end up being very simple then. How do people learn? We have to take that into consideration. What is the brain doing there? We have to know about technology, and we have to understand this in the global context. That would, sort of yield this particular model that has to do with, higher order thinking skills. There's a greater dependency on technology to actually facilitate learning. There's a lot more autonomous learning projects and research on the part of the students. So there's a different type of planning that has to take place. Teachers just cannot use the same, stand up in front of the class, here's the formula, copy this down, do it 10 times, go do homework on it, and come back and I'll give you a test. That is not going to work in the 21st century classroom anymore. So now we know that it's a dynamic, right? It's going back and forth between the facilitator, the teacher, and the learner or the student. And so there's a give and take on all of these different levels. And if we are genuine, we're also appreciating that the teacher is actually learning as much or more than the student as this is all going on, right? And again, this all takes place within the context of the environment. Okay, so the last piece has to do with technology models, and the bottom line is basically there's nothing new here, okay? The only thing that e-learning pedagogy promotes is that it's exactly identical to teachers' pedagogical knowledge in the 21st century, plus an extra dose of autonomy as well as technology. And that's it. Basically, everything that you'd expect in other models exists in online environments, but you're actually throwing in an extra plug for extra autonomy and technology. Okay, and so you can actually break this down as basically saying that you have digital natives, your knowledge framework has to be expanded to actually have access to technology and technological skills. But the content knowledge, pedagogical knowledge, and technological knowledge, all of those things join, none of that has really changed. So basically all of those things are the same, but we're just adding on this extra piece now of technology that does result in a lot more autonomy. Why is it more autonomous? Because a student can go back. Like in this video, you can stop it and go back and play 100 times, the piece that you didn't get because I spoke too fast or whatever. You are more in control of what you're learning and hearing. So you can do this over and over again until you actually dominate it, or you can look for some other piece of information to supplement what's being said here. So you don't have to rely on the teacher for learning, okay? So the typical teacher nowadays has a very limited repertoire of actions, tools, activities that they can actually apply. We need to be, the 21st century teacher has a whole lot more that they have at their fingertips, and they respond to different types of learning objectives, and teachers have to diagnose that. They have to understand, how can I best teach critical reading skills to my students? Is it just by rereading that passage 100 times in class, or what is the technology that's available to help me do that? Okay, so finally, the mind-brain education model. I only put it here because I went online to try to find other pictures and I couldn't, and this is my picture. So, but basically this idea that if you're joining elements of psychology, which has to do, developmental psychology, some aspects that Daniel was pointing out, we have to understand ages and stages of human development and cognitive development, as well as psychosocial and emotional aspects of development. We have to know all the tools within education and all of the different types of learners we have. This goes from special education to gifted learners. But we have to learn how to teach a lot of different types of audiences these days. And in neuroscience, we have this link now within all of the other natural life sciences. They have to do with biology, nutrition, chemistry. We talked a little bit about the importance of sleep, nutrition, exercise, and learning. All of these pieces have to come together to yield something better in the way we teach. And hopefully, that's where we're heading with this model. So now here's the proposal. We have a new teaching and learning process. We know that the actors are the teacher and the student. We know we need to try to change our teachers' pedagogical knowledge model, because mind-brain education is new and technology is new, and that didn't exist when these other models that we talked about today existed, right? So what do we have to do? We have to know what teachers need to know, their content knowledge, in order to teach better, okay? And we need the teachers to also know how they should teach that better, all right? And on the student side, the students need to know themselves what they need to be successful. And to do that, they need to know how they learn best. Now, both of those, I think the hows can be responded to by information from mind-brain education. So where does this all occur? We know that this can happen in virtual spaces. It's not just in your classroom. So again, this is going to impact the methodologies that teachers are actually going to apply in their classrooms, and they have to be aware of that. And when can this occur? We are hoping to form lifelong learners. And by lifelong learners, we mean people who have habituated certain types of thinking skills that they can apply until the day they die. Okay. So here's this idea. It's just a suggestion, and really love for you guys to tear it apart and come up with some other ideas here. But there's basically these 14 elements, and some of them are purely in the teacher realm, and some of them are on the student side. But most of them happen between teacher and student. Okay. So between the teacher and the student, teachers and students can learn together if they both have a buy-in to this idea about ideas about learning. Intelligence is fluid. I can learn. And that teachers believe that all the students in their class can and will learn with their guidance, all right? That we focus on mastery learning skills, that the kid isn't just comparing himself to the guy next door, but he's looking at how does he improve his own learning for his own self based on the objectives or the competencies that are laid out for that particular lesson. Not how well they did on the test, but do they get it? At the end of History 101, did they master the content of that course? Did they master that information? Not how well did they do on each little piece of homework, but how well did they do at the end of the day? When we get to the end of this learning experience, did they master the information? Okay? Clear goal setting and orientation based on this mastery. Okay? Is this clear? We have to know the right steps to take. Not that everybody has to learn at the same pace, but we all have to learn the same things. Okay? The organization and the structure of the lessons, the teacher has to take the initiative in that, but the student has to have the buy-in and also organize his own time in doing this, and to structure the way he's going to actually take on his own learning. Okay? Communication has to be open on both ends. This has to do with teachers explicitly, sharing those goals that are out there, but also making sure that the students, there's feedback in both directions, and that this teacher is actually learning from the student's feedback and not just the teacher evaluating a student, right? And that there's regulation and monitoring of this process, which is a continual cycle, which will never end, okay? On the student side, the student has to learn how to learn. And that, he's going to learn this by habituating certain skills that the teachers are going to help him with. But basically, that's the main job of a student, is to learn how to learn, so that across the lifespan, they'll be able to do that. The teacher now has to take on a lot of new things, though. These are things that didn't exist, 50 years ago. They have to know mind-brain education content. They have to know information about technology and 21st century skills. Professionalism has changed because of the dynamics of our social context now. We're now in a globalized world. So we have professional responsibilities, ethical responsibilities that go beyond just our own classrooms, right? The execution of learning activities is still within the realm of the teacher. It always has been, but they're different types of learning activities now. There's different things they're going to have to know and learn, okay? And similarly, and one of the biggest challenges I see is evaluation and assessment activities. We have to get away from this standardized testing things, and we have to come up with much more sophisticated ways of measuring what's really important. Those bigger skills, those 21st century skills that we were talking about in the previous slides. Okay, so if these are the 14 elements, right? So they're very similar to what Johanna shared with us, right? In Seidel's model, related to the time for learning, the organization of learning, the social context of learning, the goal setting, communication, the professionalism, mastery learning, execution of activities, evaluation, regulation and monitoring, beliefs about learning, and what students need to know themselves, as well as mind-brain education and technology. Those are the same 14 elements which were just shown here, okay? Now, if they're broken down, and this is the document that I'm sending you, I'd like you to add on to this, okay? Because there's bound to be many more ideas than I've just listed here, or that I was able to write down from what you folks all said in the last meeting. And so please, help shore up this list, type it in, do it in track changes so that we can all know who added what or whatever, because that's very helpful. So related to the competency of time for learning, how much time on task is given? Is there homework? And are we developing lifelong learning skills? And the organization of learning, it's basically how classroom management is held, discipline control, and how we are able to keep disturbances to a minimum so that we can actually focus on the task of learning and not on disciplining kids in the classroom. In the social environments, the third element has to do with a lot of different things. The learning climate, how much control a student has over their own learning, learning orientations, high expectations, differentiation, inclusion. All of these other things are sub areas. So inclusion includes understanding common learning problems, which might be dyslexia, dyscalculia, ADHD, Asperger's, things that might come up with enough frequency in the classroom that teachers have to know. They also need to understand about at-risk populations. They need to understand the possible impacts, but not limitations, of socioeconomic status, importance of early experiences, and how that actually can change. Your biology, the potentiation of certain genes will change given early experiences. So that needs to be taught, as well as the cultural context. You're going to notice here, Daniel, that some things that you mentioned for mind-brain education, I've included in different categories just because they seem to make sense to me. They don't have to stay there at all. I'd like the group to put them where they think is most important, okay? In the fourth category and fifth category are goal setting and communication. So goal setting has to do with shared goals, that they're clear and they're structured. So the students know when they're achieving things, that they can become more autonomous in their learning, and that they've got hooks, these anchors that help them understand their real, authentic context for learning information. Under communication, teachers need to know about teacher clarity. They can't have, this has to do with also the goal setting points, right? They have to have a good, clear language that's understood by the student. They have to have immediate reply. This has a lot to do with, the time is ripe. You have to choose the right moment to say things in order for students to understand and to follow your processes. Teacher self-efficacy. Does the teacher believe in himself? There's a huge impact. If a student doubts, the teacher doubts that he knows something, the students don't even bother to learn. So we have to help teachers understand this aspect of communication. Same thing with body language, interpretation of faces and voices, and general interpersonal skills. We also know that novice versus expert, this traveling along this continuum of professionalization is really important. We know that there's a difference between novice and experts in how they understand knowledge, how they solve problems, what do they understand about pedagogy, just their general toolkit grows, okay? And also this whole concept of mastery learning. And I would say that can be summed up in a single process, which has to do with backward design, deciding what the objective is, then what is my criteria for evaluation, and then what are my activities. So if mastery can be equated to those objectives, then we keep the same objectives for everybody, but we can evaluate and we can have different activities for those students in order to reach the objectives. So that just makes it pure mastery learning as opposed to, covering the textbook kind of learning. Mastery learning also has to do with understanding curriculum design. What should go first, second, third, how should we order the presentation of materials. In teaching, which is the biggest category, right, execution of learning activities, there's a lot of elements, right? Understanding the learner and the learning process, understanding the social interaction and direct experience, how working with others through cooperative learning or reciprocal teaching helps learning, general methodologies, activities, actions, whether it be direct instruction, which is needed sometimes, versus problem-solving, cues, questioning. All of these things are different, and I haven't listed by any means all of the different methodologies that exist or activities. But these are some of the most common ones. But the idea is being able to teach the teacher how to choose the best methodologies given their objectives, okay? How basic information processing occurs. And I wasn't sure if this goes here or should go under mind-brain education, but it's here for now, okay? And then domain-specific information processing. How do students understand math? I mean, Daniel's a genius in this area as far as understanding, mathematical processing, understanding of numeracy, number sense in a kid's brain. How does that develop, and how is that very much a constructivist process? It's one thing builds on another, so you can't skip steps, okay? Then we have evaluation, regulation, and the ideas about learning. Within evaluation, I told you this is one of our biggest challenges, I think, in the 21st century, is understanding how our tools have to change because our objectives have changed. You can't measure critical thinking on a multiple choice test. I mean, you just can't do some of the things we now state are our objectives for 21st century learners. Our tools are inadequate for that, okay? So we have to understand things about evaluation that relate to learning as well. How can we accelerate, learners so they're not bored? How can we remediate for kids who need extra help, all right? Then regulation and monitoring have to do with the support systems that are available, as well as teaching kids to self-regulate. And the ideas and beliefs about learning, going back to this whole idea of constructivism, it's very important that teachers get it. There's still some teachers who are still in this, behavioralist models, and they think that they can condition people into anything. They need to understand better that things are, concepts are built off another, right? And this huge belief that, your brain can change. Intelligence is fluid. No matter what you're born with, you can get better at it, okay? And also this belief that it's not just the students who are doing the learning. Teachers are learning as well. Student responsibilities is another big list, but learning how to learn is at the top of them. All of these other skills are basically sub-skills of that. And these are things that we have to balance when we're looking at the model that Sonia showed us, between student and teacher, between the teaching learning process. What is it that we have to do as teachers? What do teachers have to know to help students learn better, okay? And then in mind-brain education, which is the biggest category, I guess, because Daniel was so eloquent in breaking down all the pieces, there's just tons of pieces here. So, and I'm not sure if I've categorized them in the correct way, but I added on a few of those after we spoke because of my own work. But tell me if any of these things make sense. I think the teachers need to understand how this multiple lens of neuroscience, psychology, and education is going to help us diagnose problems better and actually treat things better, right? They have to understand that there's different levels of analysis. So wearing an MBE hat means that you are going from cells to the kid in front of you in the seat. So there's a lot of different levels that you can take in information, right? Big point, we have to learn to be critical consumers of information. There's a lot of garbage out there, and we just have to learn how to take in the right information, right? The methods that there are to study mind-brain education and the limitations of those methods as well. Observation techniques, teachers do have the opportunity to do more experiments, I think, in a single day than most neuroscientists do in their whole life, but they just don't document their practice. So how can we observe and document things that are happening in our classroom? Then there's these content area things. So Daniel mentioned things like plasticity. To understand you're in charge of your own brain. You want to make some decisions or changes, it's up to you. Your brain didn't take over your mind. Your mind can take over your brain, so you have to sort of understand that dichotomy there. Understand the basics of the nervous system, this idea of critical versus sensitive periods, going beyond Piaget and Vygotsky into this idea of ages and stages and understanding different stages of development, cognitive, social, emotional, and motor development. This global idea of health and wellness, understanding what things can have an impact on learning that are in the environment, the role, and then specific areas, memory, attention, executive functions, affect, motivation. Music I put with a question mark, spaced versus mass practice. There's a ton of other things that we can consider as core content knowledge for Joe Average Teacher. But the two I would never let go of would be memory and attention. Without memory or without attention, there is no learning. So I think at a minimum, teachers need to be really clear about memory systems and attentional systems. This idea of the role of biology in learning, understanding genetics, drugs, stress, how that can impact learning. And then also this mind-brain connection between, or mind-body connection between sleep, exercise, and nutrition. And finally, technology. So how has the medium changed the message that we're learning? And teachers just need to know what exists out there, because I think a lot of teachers, if they just knew how easy it is to use some technologies, would apply them more, but they just don't know that they're out there. Okay, so that's it. That's the idea of this global model. Totally open to suggestions. I am not married to this idea at all. It's just how it's coming together in my own head, and so I just sort of leave it at that. That's basically where I would put it after looking at the hundreds of articles that you all have uploaded to my Dropbox space. Trying to put all that together to come to some kind of an idea in my own head of how we can actually marry all of these different ideas together. It doesn't have to look like this. It's probably like a kind of Mickey Mouse version of what we might consider, but I think the sooner we can nail down a framework, the more advanced our work can be, because we'll be able to actually go to the next stage of actually defining each of these pieces a bit better. So, okay, well, that's it. I welcome all your comments. Thank you. Bye.